And so with that, I want to make sure that we put on our hats, we put on our glasses, we really put our hands together. Dr. Michael Wu goes all over the world for Lithium, and not just on behalf of the brand. One of the things that makes Michael Wu so good at what he does is he doesn't talk about it from a brand and company perspective. He talks about it from something very pure, from the science of it, from what he sees in the data and the numbers. And while that's not always exactly where I'm coming at it from the market, the thing that Michael brings is a level of credibility, honesty, and I think intelligence, making sense of what's going on in this whole world. He is a lovely person, and he's a phenomenal scientist. Please put your hands together for Dr. Michael Wu.
Thank you, Katie.
Can I get a picture with you? I just
of course.
want to pretend I hang out with really smart people. Awesome. Knock 'em dead.
All right. Wow, this is something eerily weird about this looking. So it almost feels like looking in the mirror. I actually want a selfie with all of you. Let me see. I'm sure we have time afterward for a selfie at an individual level, but at the moment, I do like to see if I could get a selfie with all of you. Wow, that looks pretty cool. All right, I have to put this down. Oops, oh, almost. All right. All right, got half of my face. You can see that I'm not very good at selfie. So. Okay, so I know I'm not going to top yesterday's closing with Sal Khan, his amazing story about how his inspiring story, as well as Oni Adams' humor. In fact, humor is not my strong suit. My wife always said that I'm almost like I have no sense of humor at all. But I thought I could do something that's a little bit interesting, such as a little bit of math combined with a little bit of humor. And so for that, I'm going to tell you a little story. So this is a story about a shepherd, and he actually has 3 sons, and he's dying. He has 17 camels, and as he's dying, he basically says that he had a will. He said, I want to actually give my older son half of my camels, and then I want to give my second son the third of the camels, and I want to give my younger son the ninth of the camels. And so that's a problem, of course, because 17 actually doesn't divide into 2, doesn't divide into 3, doesn't divide into 9. In fact, it's actually a prime number, right? So it doesn't divide into anything. So how do you solve this problem without splitting camels? How do you solve this problem? So we learned from yesterday, we've got to turn to the smarter species, right? So the 3 sons actually went to a wise old lady, and the wise old lady says, well, you know what? To solve this problem, how about this? I have 1 extra camel. I want to just give you my camel. And then now they have 18 camels. Okay? They say, well, now, of course, 18 divides into 2 very nicely. You got 9. Divides into 3, you got 6. Right? And then divide into 9, you get 2. Right? So after they split up all the camels, what happened? 9 plus 6 plus 2 is what? 17. And they're left with 1 camel. They don't know what to do, and they give it back to the old lady. Right? Now, if you don't think that's a little bit of humorous, a little bit of interesting, a little bit of, then you probably don't have emotion. All right, so as we heard this morning that from some of the presentation that most of the competition between brands now will be on customer experience. So this is a chance for me to kind of share a little bit of my work on the framework that I developed on understanding and measuring customer experience. And then this is the agenda that I will kind of follow. Basically, I'll talk about the relativity frameworks, and then a little bit of the science and psychology behind what people expect and what people compare. And then we're going to talk about data and how do we use data to quantify and measure customer experience. So, but before I begin, let me just ask you guys, why is customer experience so important? Why is that a hot topic today, these days? Think about this. The answer is really simple. It's good for business, right? Because, I mean, some people actually have done stock analysis over 6 years period of time using Forrester's Customer Experience Index to compare performance of leaders in customer experience versus laggers in customer experience. And guess what? The leaders actually do much better, 30% better, and then the laggers does worse, right? It's good for business. And now, given that customer experience is so important, next question for you guys. You guys are all not very smart, right? So what makes the experience good? That's also very simple. Basically, it's characterized by one equation, right? You just have to deliver more than what the consumer expects. Right? So in some rough sense, customer experience is really just the difference between what you deliver and what the consumer expects. Right? If you actually, if consumer's expectation is at that level, and you are delivering at that exact level, your consumer will be satisfied. And if you actually deliver more, your consumer will be delighted. And if you deliver less than that than their expectation, then your consumer will be disappointed, right? So now the problem isn't what you're delivering today. You all have been delivering, what you've been delivering to the consumers for a long time. The problem today is that consumers' expectation has risen. So even though you have been delivering exactly the same way you have been, you are still going to end up with a disappointed consumer, right? So, so basically, this is why we call this relativity, right? Everything is relative to the level of your consumer's expectation. So notice this talk, the title of this talk is called the Relativity Framework. If anybody knows anything about relativity, everything is relative, right? Einstein basically says that even space and time is actually relative. So today we are actually going to talk about space and time, okay? So this actually brings us to the framework. So this is actually the relativity framework. So of course there's space. Now space tells you where things happen, and time tells you when things happen. So let's focus on the time component for a minute. The time component is basically the customer's journey. Now, I mean, I call this awareness, research, buy, use, support, and share. Nate would call this discovery, exploring, and then buying, and use different names, but the same idea, okay? Same 6 stage. Now, space is where things get really interesting, okay? The space is actually where, essentially, they're the communication channels. And there are actually many, many of these communication channels out there. I kind of classify them into the traditional channels, the really old traditional channel, and there's also digital channels, and now today we are moving the mobile age, right? So mobile becomes a very, very important channel as well. So let's take a look at some of these channels a little bit more carefully. So for the under the traditional channel, there's physical locations such as event, a store that you visit, right? A place that you can go to. And there's also people, right? Real people, friends and family, partners, colleagues that you interact with, right? And there's also print medium, right? Print media like magazine, newspaper. People still read those. And these are what I call the physical channels, right? Things that you could touch, feel, and so on and so forth. And then we move on to the electronic age. Right? Once we move into the electronic age, there's actually TV, radios, right? And then these are what I call analog media. And then there's also agent-assisted media. These are basically phone and chat. And then we move on to the next stage again. Right? The next stage is the digital revolution. The digital revolution, now we're trying to actually replicate a lot of stuff in the traditional channel, right? Replicate a lot of stuff in the digital world. Instead of having a physical location, now you have a digital version of that location. So it's essentially a website, right? Essentially the web address. Instead of having a real event like this, you have essentially digital events, a virtual event. Instead of print medium, you have digital content, infographic, and so on and so forth, right? And then there's, again, another wave of revolution comes on. That's the social revolution. So social comes on. Social basically consists of a lot of community of interest. These are YouTube, Pinterest, Instagram, blogs, and all that stuff. And also you have community that are hosted by Lithium. These are branded customer community. And there's also social network. These are, of course, you're very familiar with these, right? Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google+, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there's also another wave of revolution coming. That's the mobile revolution, right? So basically, again, in mobile, we basically try to replicate everything in the digital world again, right? So all this, so I call this mobile, web, and social. Basically, you can access pretty much everything in digital on your mobile devices, right? So you could access all your Facebook and everything on your mobile devices. And there's also app. What's new in mobile is these group-based chat, right? Such as LINE, WhatsApp, WeChat. Anybody use those? They're getting pretty popular these days, right? Okay. So that's mobile. Now, when you actually cross the customer journey with these communication channels, you basically create touch points. You create a whole bunch of grids. Right? These different grids is what made up this framework. Okay, now you can be very granular in this grid. Right? For example, like in the time domain, you can have, during the research phase or exploration phase, you could have a interested phase, a phase where you start to compare products and actually start to decide what you want to buy, and then eventually you buy it, right? And then during the use phase, maybe if you're buying a software, maybe there is an install, a run, and an upgrade phase, right? Maybe during the support, you actually have several different attempts and you're trying to get support, right? So there may be a first, second, third, and fourth attempt. And similarly, you can also be very granular in the spatial dimension as well, such as you can actually split up the search engine into each individual search engine, and for example, split up the community of interest into blocks, interests, whichever community of interest that you want to focus on, and the different social network as well, right? But you don't have to be as granular as you could be as granular as you want, and you could be as coarse as you want, depending on what type of question you want to answer. And of course, this framework is constantly growing as we have more and more devices like such a wearable and coming on, Internet of Things coming on. Those may create new type of communication channel that you could add to the framework as well. So that's basically the framework. Now, so when you talk about customer experience, you really mean the experience on every single one of these touch points. Every single one of these. And there's a lot of touch points, right? There are a lot of grids here. This framework is so big that I don't think there's a company, I don't think there's any single company where there's one person in the company that's responsible for the entire framework. Usually it's some different roles that are responsible for different parts of this grid. For example, you may be a CMO, and you may be really interested in the digital experience. You may have a store, and the in-store experience is what you focus on. And you may be a mobile strategist, and so mobile experience is what you focus on. And you may want to create good social customer experience. That's where Lithium could really help you, right? And if you're in sales, you may be really interested in the pre-sales experience. If you are in package design, right, or something, you may be really interested in the out-of-the-box experience. If you're in product, building product, or actually designing product, right, then this product experience is what you want to focus on. If you are, again, in support, then the support experience is what you want to focus on, right? So basically, this framework is so big and so complete that I don't think there's a person in the company that's responsible for everything. But what that also tells us is that customer experience is really everybody's job. Everyone is responsible in some way, one way or another, for the customer's experience. Okay? All right. Now, okay, so given that framework, what does a typical customer's experiential journey look like? What does the customer's experience journey like? Well, we know that it has to move forward in time, right? Physics actually don't allow us to kind of move back in time. If I could move back in time, then I probably wouldn't be here. But anyway, it moves forward in time. But as you move forward in time, you don't actually go through all the different channels, right? You jump between different channels. So it really looks more like this. Okay, you jump between different channels, right? It's hard to follow that dot around, so I'm going to just annotate a little bit, right? So if this person actually found out the product, on a TV ad, and then he Googled for it and to find out some information about it. And he found some community interest. He checked it out, and then eventually he actually go to the store and check it out. And then he actually buys this product on the website, and then he uses this product in the real world. I think there's only one place you could use anything in the real world, right? And when he has support problems, he actually Google again for solutions. And he found some community to help him. And when he actually couldn't find the answer, eventually he actually called the agent. And finally, he actually shared some of his experience in some of his social network and on some of his group-based chat. So this is the customer journey for one person. One person would look like this, OK? All right, so given this framework, now let's take a little bit of a pause and just kind of trying to understand a little bit about what the science behind expectation. What do people compare and what do people expect? Okay? Now this is going to be a little bit interesting. So what do people compare? And what do people expect? Things that are actually more similar, they become more comparable, right? Let me ask you guys, would you actually compare an apple and an orange? Would you? How many say you would? You would? Can you? I mean, let me ask the phrase again. Can you compare an apple and orange? Can you? Sure. You could compare, like, you know, the vitamin content of an apple and orange. Right? You could certainly do that, right? But how about an apple and fish? Would you do that? How many would say you? I mean, how many would? I mean, you can. I mean, you certainly can, right? You could say the caloric content of an apple versus a fish, right? I mean, you could certainly do that. How about an apple and a cat? Well, you start to think like, well, you probably wouldn't make that comparison, right? So the thing to keep in mind is that things that are more similar, people tend to compare them more, right? And when they're more different, people don't tend to compare them. Now, when do people expect things to be the same? That's when I call this the variance or diversity becomes 1. That's when people expect them to be the same. Okay? What does that mean? That means when you have an apple-to-apple comparison. Right? If you only know one kind of apple, that's what I mean by the diversity and variance equal to 1. If you only know one kind of apple, you would expect them to taste, smell exactly the same. Right? The minute that you know there's 2 kinds of apple, there's Fuji apple, there's Washington apple, then you wouldn't expect them the same because you know that there's 2 different kinds of apple. Make sense? So far, so good? Okay? So so that's basically what I mean by when the variance is equal to 1. When there's only one of a kind or something, that's when people expect them to be exactly the same. Now, for business, what does that mean? That means, well, experiences from the same company or the same brand, people sort of expect them to be the same, right? Because how many HP is there? 1. How many Lithium is there? 1. How many Comcast is there? 1, right? So why should the experience with those brands and company be any different? Okay? Now, also, the experience through the same technology, people sort of expect them to be the same as well. How many Facebook is there? 1, right? How many Twitter is there? Also 1, right? So if you use Twitter to do support, consumers actually will expect Twitter to behave exactly the same way as when they actually use it to communicate with their friends and family and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so now, now that we understand a little bit about how people compare things and expect things, let's try to understand the question of why do bad experiences occur? Now, basically, bad experience happens when you have these experiential gaps. Right? These experiential gaps, one of the classic experiential gaps that we all understand, or probably even experience ourselves, is the pre-sales and post-sales experiential gap. Right? Let's take a look at on the agent channel. Right? Let's look at this, say on the phone channel. Let's focus on the phone channel here. Right? Before you buy, right, the agent is super nice to you. After you buy, don't want to talk to you anymore. Right? Experiential gap. Okay, there's many more, right? For example, you may want to reserve a taxi, and you find this really nice, clean website that you can reserve a taxi, and then what comes to pick you up is this. Not what you expected. Again, right? Experiential gap. Again, there's many more. For example, you may have a very well-organized website, and then it's completely non-responsive and social. And you may have an amazing TV ad, and you get horrible reviews on community of interest. You may have a very vibrant community, but it is not on mobile at all, right? So basically, when you move from one touch point to another, when the experience is different, that creates an experiential gap that gives people a bad experience. Okay? Make sense? All right. Now, let's go dig this problem a little bit deeper, right? Let's ask the question like, why do experiential gap give people bad experience? Think about that for a minute. Okay? Basically, when there's two experiences with the same brand, the same company, where they're expecting the same, right? People tend to default to expect the better one, right? And if you have multiple experiences with the same brand, then typically people expect the near best. That's what people expect. Now, people typically don't expect you to, give them the best experience every single time. For example, if you get upgraded to first class, right, then you probably don't expect that to happen every single time because that's probably an outlier. But you do expect people to be pretty nice and treat you nicely. Near best is what people typically expect. Now, what else actually changes consumers' expectation? Basically, past experience also affects people's experience with the brand. And there, people actually expect the historical near best, right? If you have experience with the brand over multiple times, they actually expect the near best, right? Of all the historical kind of interaction with the brand. Now, also experiences with other comparable brands, right? Now, remember I said about comparable brand? Comparable brands are typically brands that are pretty similar to you, right? They have to be pretty similar for them to be comparable. Otherwise, it wouldn't make a comparison. Okay, so how do you actually reduce this type of experiential gap? Well, for one thing, customers actually don't expect to be delighted every single time. What they do expect is a consistent experience, right? So typically what we say, a consistent experience is often a good enough experience. It's actually good enough, it's satisfactory. And so how do you provide a consistent experience? Well, I mean, it doesn't make sense for you to kind of decrease the experience where you're doing great, right? Because, I mean, basically it just make the gap even bigger, right? So it's actually going to be worse. So you can only increase the experience where you're actually doing bad. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that? Remember that little equation that I showed earlier? Right? Basically, how do you increase customer experience? Make it a greater value. You could either increase your delivery or decrease people's expectation, right? Those are the two things that in that equation that you could kind of play around with. So how do you decrease expectation? Well, we all know about something called expectation setting, right? So that's management, right? So for one thing, like, don't always try to delight your customer, right? If you do, what will happen? What will happen? That becomes a new expectation, right? When that becomes a new expectation, then you always have to be delivered at that level, and if you can't, then you're going to have that experiential gap again. Okay? And another one is basically what I said earlier is set expectation. Right? If you have a support issue that would take 5 days to resolve, right? You tell them, oh, it's probably going to take a week, and you actually solve it in 5 days, they're going to be pleasantly happy. Right? Airlines do this very often. Right? They're going to say, they're going to tell you they're going to expect to arrive at this time, and probably it's the worst case. And if they arrive earlier, then you're going to be pleasantly happy. Now, how do you increase delivery? Think about this a little bit. Well, basically, it comes down to reducing the customer's investment of their resources, right? We all know that if you actually decrease the price, people tend to expect less, right? When you decrease the price, people expect less. But there's actually more different kind of resource that you could actually decrease. I mean, this is actually a different talk that I give on gamification. These are the different type of resource that you can decrease. For example, if you make it simpler so people don't have to think a lot or use a lot of effort. For example, you don't make them invest a lot of time or attention or permission, right? And if you don't third type of resources are what I call adaptability resources. These are things where people don't have to learn new things or do things differently, then they will treat those things as simpler, right? And when they're actually having a simpler, lower their investment, then they actually expect a little less. Okay, so if you actually can't do that, then keep in mind that the end of the experience actually matters a little more. So if you can't actually deliver more, try to deliver more at the end, right? So it actually matters a little more. Now, so we talk about delighting customers, right? It's good to delight customer, but we should not always delight customer. So when do you actually delight customer? Well, keep in mind that past experience had to be remembered in order to be comparable to the experience now. Now, when you actually, so basically the best time to use delight is to create this remembrance, create this memory, so they can be recalled and they be compared to other experience. Now, you want to make sure that this doesn't actually turn into expectation. Once it turns into expectation, then you're pretty much dead, right? Basically, the expectation is risen, and you have to deliver at that new level of expectation. So these are situations when people are comparing your brand with yourself, either like comparing your past experience with your current experience with the brand. Now, what happens when you're actually being compared against another brand? That's when they actually try to make the apple-to-apple comparison, right? They actually think that it's actually an apple-to-apple comparison. Now, if it's actually true, right? If it's actually true that you are not delivering compared to your competitor, then the best way to do is just fix it, right? I mean, there's no better way to just fix the problem. But if it's not the case, then what do you do? Basically, what you do is that you have to emphasize on the differentiation. You have to emphasize on the difference. Right? Your consumer may think that this is an apple-to-apple comparison, but you have to tell them that this is actually not an apple-to-apple comparison. This is actually an apple and orange, right? So what does that do to the consumer? Well, they won't expect them to be the same anymore, right? They may still compare you because you are so similar, but at least they won't expect them to be the same, because now they understand the difference, okay? So now let's move on to the next part where we're actually trying to quantify the customer experience. All right, so let's take a look at this framework again. Okay, this framework, like I said, this is actually a lot of grids. Like a framework is very, very big and very complete. So where should you focus on? Well, to answer that question, we could look at some properties of these this different communication channel. So one of the properties you could look at is the spatial temporal property. Right, so if you look at the physical channels, these are what I call the spatial temporal. They're spatially localized, and they're temporally synchronous. That means you have to be at the same place at the same time in order to interact with the brand. Right? For example, at this event, you have to be here at this location at this time in order to participate in this event. Otherwise, if you come tomorrow, we're going to be all gone. Right? Now, when you actually move on to the next set of channels, right? When you get to the print, starting with the print medium, right, and the electronic channels, it becomes much more spatially dispersed, right? But stuff mostly synchronous, right? So certainly print medium, you could consume that anytime you want, but for all the electronic channels, TVs and radios and like on phone, they had to be consumed synchronously, right? You had to be at the same time. The agent had to be on the other side, had to pick up the phone in order to answer and interact with you at the same time. Now, when you actually get to the digital channels, that's when they start to be, things are much, much more dispersed, and they don't have to be consumed at the same time, right? You could participate in a virtual conference a month later after it happened, right? You could read a digital content, a white paper, much, much later, right? When it gets to mobile, it's actually even more spatially dispersed. It's so spatially dispersed that we call this spatially ubiquitous. Right? Because we are pretty much with our mobile phone all the time. Right? I'm sure that if they created a waterproof phone, we'd probably take it to shower with us. So if you look at this property of this channel, what does that mean? That means like if you actually want to reach the greatest number of people, mobile is what you want to focus on. Right? It has the widest spatial reach compared to all the other channels. Right? And moreover, it actually replicates a lot of stuff in digital as well, right? So that's where we want to go. So let's look at another set of property. These are what I call the data accessibility property, right? Okay, so let's look at some of the traditional channels. Traditional channels are actually, sorry, I meant one back, sorry. Can you go back 2 click? Yeah, thank you. Okay, all right. So the traditional channels are what I call transient. And that means that if they're actually, they're not actually tracked. An event like this, right, is typically, if you have a meeting with some clients or something, typically those are not being recorded, right? An event like this is probably recorded. But even if they are recorded, they are actually not public, meaning the rest of the world can't participate, or they don't get to view this event. And now when you actually start with the print medium, things start to be a little bit persistent. It means you can actually track them, right? How do you actually track print medium? Have you thought about that? Everybody use a coupon? Right? Coupons are print medium, right, basically. If you use it, they know that you use it, right? So, so you could track some print medium, right? But certainly all the electronic channel and the traditional digital channels, they're all trackable. You could instrument method to track them. And when you get to social, that's when something really interesting happens, right? So all these channels up to the traditional channels here, they're trackable, but they're all kind of opaque to the rest of the world. They're not transparent. When you get to social, that's actually when it first time becomes transparent. Means that the rest of the world also see it. Okay, it's public now. It's not only is it trackable, it's actually accessible to the rest of the world. Now, what happens when you get to mobile? Mobile is really interesting because you almost hit an inflection point when you hit social, right? So it's definitely still trackable, it's persistent, but now it's selectively transparent. Right? And sometimes it's even opaque, right? You don't know, some of the interaction on mobile with your friends are not visible to the rest of the world. Right? Certainly on these group-based chats such as WhatsApp, WeChat, LINE, and all that stuff, those are only visible to a select group of people, right? If I want to go hiking this weekend, the rest of the world don't have to know about it, right? I just have to create a group on my WeChat, and then I just coordinate among those, the group of hiking buddies that I have. Okay? So why is this data accessibility property is important? This property is really important is because when you look at this customer journey, the consumer journey, it looks like it ends right there, right? But it actually doesn't end, right? There's actually no end to this. I mean, typically, what happens is that some of the journey actually do end, but you probably don't want them to end, right? What you want is that you want them to actually revisit this journey over and over again. That's what loyalty is all about, right? Consumers may not actually revisit this journey all the way from the beginning, right? Because they probably are aware of your brand already, right? They may actually do some research on new products, but typically if they already know your product and know what they want to buy, they kind of re-enter this journey through the buy stage. Okay? Now, what does that actually mean? You often heard that customer service is the new marketing, right? This is why. Because look at this. Right before you buy is from the support, your service experience from the previous cycle, right? You kind of re-enter this loop again and again and again, right? This is why we call customer service is the new marketing. If you don't serve your customers right, basically, you break this cycle, right? They're not going to buy from you again the next time. So what that means is that like the experience, because of these data accessibility properties of these different channels, the social channels actually have the strongest influence, right? It means that not only it's going to influence your purchase decision in the next cycle, because it's visible to the rest of the world, you are going to influence other people's purchase decision as well. Okay? So if you actually want to focus on the longevity of your brand, you want to focus on social. Okay. Now, there's also a more data-driven approach to tackle this problem. So I previously have shown you the customer's experience journey for one person. Right? This is what it looks like. What happened when you map the customer journey for another person? What would it look like? Would it look exactly the same? Probably not. Right? It probably looks something different. If you map it for another person, it may look slightly different again. If you map it for another person, it may look slightly different. If you do this for a lot of people, you start to see some patterns start to emerge. What do you see there? Some touch points are heavily visited. These touch points, right? Those are the touch points that you want to focus on. Those are the touch points that you want to focus on to measure what people's experiences are on those touch points, because those are the touch points that matters the most, right? So if you actually measure the customer experience on those touch points, you may get some results like this, and you would know where you want to focus, right? This company, right, is doing a pretty good job on search engine and this website, but the product has a little bit work. Where it really needs to focus on is to fix their brand community, and Lithium can help with that, right? Okay, so that's a data-driven approach. Now, if you are a very operational kind of person, you say, well, how do you actually measure the experience on those channels? Well, good question, right? Good question. So you can actually, so let's move on to the next phase where we actually talk about how do we actually use this framework. So this is, so for one thing is that you can actually ask your customer, right? Do you have a good experience? Are you delighted or are you disappointed, right? So basically we can survey them. So there's a 3-step survey that I developed. Basically, first you can, it's the awareness question, right? I first learn about this product through this channel, right? You have all the channels and they could pick one. And then you ask the preference question. I prefer to use these set of channels to do research, buy, and get support, right? So there are actually three different questions there. And you can check all that applies. And the next question is, which one have they actually used? Right? I actually have used this channel to do research, buy, and get support. And you check all that applies too. And finally, you ask the experience question, right? For the ones that you have checked, you want to ask them, are you disappointed, satisfied, or delighted on those channels? Okay? So with that, you basically have, you would know what the customer experience is like on those touch points. But as you know, that when you survey people, typically the response rate is very, very low. Right? You probably get like less than 1%, like 1% if you're lucky, right? Response rate. Now, how do you actually get a more complete picture of people's customer experience? How do you get more data? How do you get more data? This is where big data, machine learning, and data science comes to help. Okay? So you can't get me up here without talking a little bit about machine learning. So we're going to talk about machine learning. So here's where you have to start thinking, what customer interaction data do you have? I have lots of. That means have it for a lot of customers. Okay? Lots of customers. This is a big data problem, right? Now keep in mind that these are actually data about the interaction with you. They're not data about the customer, right? Knowing the customer is male or female, their age, it's not going to tell you what the experience is. But knowing how they interact with you does. You may still use those customer data as a auxiliary variable. They help, but they're not going to tell you the experience if you don't have the interaction data. Now, so let's take a look at some examples of these. What would these interaction data like? So for example, you may have product usage data. You may have, basically that's when a customer is interacting with your product and service. Like if you have a usage data log, then those would be how customers interact with your product. You may have marketing engagement data, right? Whether they actually open your email, download the white paper, those are marketing engagement data. It's actually an interaction with your marketing effort, right? Your marketing collaterals. And support operation data. When they call you, right? How long do they wait, right? These are interaction data with your call center. Finally, there's also like social media behavior data. Basically, they're all behavior data of some sort, right? Because those behavior data is actually much more predictive of people's experience than data about the customer, right? About like static data such as age, demographic, and so on and so forth. So now, how do you actually turn these data into customer experience data? Well, let's take a look at an example with call center, right? Let's say you have 10 million customers, right? This is your entire customer base. And these are people who actually come to you for support. So I mean, at some point in time, right? At any point in time, maybe a small fraction of those people come to you for support. But throughout your entire company's operation, right, probably a lot of customers had come to your support at one point in time, right? So you actually have a lot of data on a lot of customers, right? Maybe like 30, 40, 50% of the customer may at some point contact you for support, okay? Now, that means you actually have a lot of operational data on those customers, right? Such as wait time, handle time, number of calls per issue, number of agents who handle a particular issue, number of issue per year, so on and so on. You have lots of data on this customer, right? This call center operation data. Now, those are the people that you want to actually survey, right? Those are the people that you want to survey. And now when you actually survey those people, like I said, you're going to get a very low response rate. You probably get like, say 1%, okay? Maybe sometimes lower. So let's assume that you have 50% of the customer actually come to your support at some point in their lifetime. So you get 5 million. And basically, you survey those 5 million people, and you get 1% response rate. Basically, you're going to get about 50,000 customer experience data. Right? For 50,000 people, you will know what their experience is like, whether they are delighted or disappointed, right? Or satisfied. So now, next step is basically you need to build a model, right? The trick is actually building that model to translate those operational data to the customer's experience data. How do you do that? How do you do that, right? So you can do a rule-based type of model, right? For example, you say, okay, I know that people who don't like to wait a long time. So if people have waited for more than 10 minutes, that's a bad experience. But is that always work? Maybe it depends on whether the issue is resolved too, right? Because you have that whether the issue is resolved as a variable that you track in the call center as well. So if you actually resolve that issue, then maybe people are willing to wait a little longer, right? If you didn't actually resolve the issue, then you actually having them wait for 10 minutes is going to be a very bad experience. But it also depends on the customers, kind of what kind of customer they are. Are they a premium customer? If they're a premium customer, maybe they actually, will wait a lot less time. So as you can see, with all this variable, all these kind of hundreds of call center operational data you have, the rules that you could create become very, very complicated, right? So that's where machine learning comes to help. The trick of machine learning is that you don't have to describe what those rules are, okay? You just show them examples of what good experience looks like and what bad experience look like. And now you actually have those data, right? For those 50,000 people, you have their experience, so you know whether they have good experience or bad experience, but you also have their call center operation data for those people as well. So this is, for those people, what these people have good experience, and you actually show them that the operation data, what they look like. These people actually had bad experience, what their operational data actually look like, right? You show the machine and let the machine come up with the rule for you, right? You don't actually have to describe the rule yourself. Now, when you do that, you get a model. Once you get a model, you have to go back and kind of think that, okay, now I actually have 5 million data points, 5 million, I have call center operation data for 5 million people. You can actually feed those data into the model. Right? Once you feed those data into the model, the model is going to output, it's going to predict what the experience is like for those 5 million people. Now you have customer experience data for 5 million people. Isn't that cool? Thank you. All right. So with that, you should be able to figure out what the customer experience is like and fill out the framework. So next is what do you actually do? What do you actually do? Okay, so as I said before, this framework is very complete and very big. Not a single person in the company is responsible for every single part of this grid. So first step is to identify what's your responsibility. Which subset of the grid are you responsible for? Then the next step is you have to see which one of those grids that you're responsible for you have access to data immediately. Okay? Because you need data to measure customer experience. right? You can't help with that. And the next step is you have to survey and collect some training data, right? Those are the training data that you need to train the model. Once you collected those data, those training data, for example, the 50,000 that I talked about before, you need to actually identify some data science resource to help you build that model, right? Internally or externally, whatever you want to do, right? That's up to you. And then you will have basically the customer experience data for those grids that you're trying to measure. But that's not the end of it, right? After you have those data, you have to basically share and disseminate it within your company. So I show you an example with call center, right? That's probably the responsibility of a VPs of support. But now you have the experience for your customers' experience on the support channels. You can actually take it to the marketing and ask them to show them the data and say, well, do you know what kind of experience are they having with your marketing collateral, with your marketing efforts? Right? Are you creating a negative experiential gap for me, or am I creating a negative experiential gap for you? Right? So you get them to figure out their part of the grid as well, right? And slowly, bit by bit, right, as more and more people start to figure out different part of the grid, you will have a much more complete picture of what the customer experience is like. And with that, you should be able to compete much more effectively in this changing market. Thank you very much. Thanks.